It was supposed to be a routine expedition into the heart of South Africa's Mandela Catalogue. My friends and I had always been drawn to the abandoned shopping mall, rumored to be a hub for paranormal activity. The locals avoided it, whispering tales of an unsettling presence that lingered in its empty corridors. We dismissed the stories as mere urban legend, but our curiosity got the better of us. As we approached the mall's entrance, a sense of unease settled over me. The once vibrant facade now seemed decrepit and worn, with peeling paint and rusting metalwork that seemed to sag under its own weight. The words Mandela Catalogue were still visible, but they appeared faded and weathered, as if the very name itself was trying to be erased. Our group consisted of 5 friends: Emma, a history buff; Matt, an engineer; Rachel, a photographer; Alex, a thrill seeker; and me, a writer. We had all been friends since college and always shared our deepest fears and desires with each other. This expedition was our way of facing our collective anxieties head-on. As we stepped inside the mall, a musty smell wafted out, making us cough. The air was stale and heavy, like a physical presence that pressed against our lungs. We fumbled for our flashlights, casting flickering shadows on the walls as we ventured deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the creaks and groans of the old structure. We began to explore, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we delved further into the heart of the mall. Emma wandered ahead, her eyes scanning the old storefronts for any signs of life or history. Matt followed closely behind, his engineer's mind analyzing every creak and groan of the building. Rachel snapped photos, trying to capture the eerie atmosphere on film. Alex led the way, his thrill-seeking nature drawing us deeper into the depths of the mall. And I trailed behind, my writer's senses drinking in the sights, sounds, and smells that surrounded me. It was then that we stumbled upon a door hidden behind a tattered awning. The sign above it read, "Employee Only." Matt raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the secrecy surrounding this entrance. Without hesitation, Alex pushed the door open, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into darkness. We exchanged uneasy glances before following him into the unknown. The air grew colder as we descended deeper into the corridor. The sound of our footsteps seemed to fade into the distance, replaced by an unsettling hum, a low-pitched vibration that echoed through every corner of the mall. As we walked down the corridor, the hum grew louder, but it was still impossible to pinpoint its source. The air seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy, making my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes were trained on us from the shadows. Emma stumbled upon an old doorstop, covered in dust and grime. She picked it up, examining it as if searching for clues. Matt began to analyze the door's lock, trying to figure out how it had been secured. Rachel snapped photos of the corridor, capturing the eerie atmosphere on film. Alex continued down the passage, his flashlight casting an uncertain glow. I lagged behind, my eyes scanning the walls for any signs of writing or symbols. The hum seemed to be coming from all directions, a maddening drone that grated on my nerves. Suddenly, Emma let out a low whistle, her eyes fixed on something in front of us. We gathered around, and that's when we saw it. A faded sign above the door at the end of the corridor, reading Department 13. The letters seemed to be worn down, as if they had been scrubbed clean by some unseen force. Matt shook his head. This must be some sort of joke. But Emma was undeterred, her curiosity piqued. She pushed open the door, revealing a room filled with rows of dusty shelves and old filing cabinets. The hum grew louder still, pulsating through every molecule of air. I felt my heart racing, my senses on high alert. We exchanged uneasy glances before Alex spoke up, his voice low and cautious. "I don't like this." Rachel's camera clicked nervously in her hand, as if it too sensed the unease that had settled over us. "What is this place?" I whispered, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of life or explanation. The hum seemed to be coming from within the filing cabinets themselves, a low-pitched thrumming that made my skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything fell silent. We stepped cautiously into the room, our eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the dusty windows. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. Emma began to scan the shelves, running her fingers over the spines of the old books and files. Matt crouched beside her, his hands moving deftly as he examined the labels on the cabinets. Rachel wandered over to a row of ancient computers, their screens cracked and dark. Alex stood at the far end of the room, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I lagged behind, my gaze drifting around the space, taking in every detail. The hum had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that seemed to press upon us. It was as if we were being weighed down by some unseen force. Suddenly, Emma let out a gasp and stumbled backwards, her eyes fixed on something she had found. Matt followed her gaze, his brow furrowed in concern. On one of the shelves, nestled between two ancient tomes, lay an old folder bound in black leather. The cover was embossed with a single word: Erebus. Emma's hand trembled as she reached out to touch it. "What is this?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel looked up from her computers, her eyes wide with curiosity. Alex remained frozen at the end of the room, his light casting an eerie glow on the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as I gazed upon the folder. There was something about it that seemed malevolent. The air around us began to thicken once more, the hum returning in a low, ominous drone. It seemed to be coming from the folder itself, pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. As we watched, the folder seemed to shift. The leather creaked and the embossed word Erebus appeared to ripple like water on a hot day. Emma took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Matt followed suit, his hand reaching out to steady her. Rachel's camera slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor as she stumbled backwards. Alex remained frozen, his light casting an eerie glow on the walls. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I gazed upon the folder. And then, without warning, the hum began. It was low and pulsing, like a heartbeat. The air around us seemed to vibrate with its presence, making every molecule of air quiver in response. The sound was almost musical, yet it sent shivers down my spine. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Matt's eyes met mine, his expression grim and urgent. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. But it was too late. The hum had already begun to seep into our minds. I felt a creeping sense of dread as the sound seemed to take on a life of its own, echoing through every corner of my brain. Emma's eyes went wide and glassy, her pupils dilating in response to some unseen stimulus. Rachel's face was twisted in fear, her eyes darting wildly around the room. Alex remained still, his expression unchanging, yet I could sense his terror radiating from him like heat. And Matt seemed to be frozen in place, his eyes fixed on something that only he could see. The hum grew louder, its pulsing rhythm seeming to synchronize with my own heartbeat. I felt myself being drawn into its depths, sucked down a rabbit hole of madness and despair. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. The room fell silent once more, leaving us all gasping for air like fish on a drowning deck. We were all shaken by the hum's sudden silence, but we knew we had to keep moving. We needed to gather information about what was happening in Mandela Catalogue and why the hum was so powerful. Emma suggested that we split up and try to find some clues, hoping to piece together what was going on. Matt agreed, his engineer's mind already racing with theories about how the hum might be generated. Rachel wanted to take photos of everything she saw, hoping to capture evidence of whatever supernatural forces were at work. Alex insisted on staying close to me, his thrill-seeking nature tempered by a newfound respect for the unknown. I volunteered to lead the way, my writer's senses on high alert as we navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Mandela Catalogue. As we walked, I noticed that the air was thick with an otherworldly energy, like a palpable presence that watched our every move. Suddenly, Alex grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side room, his eyes fixed on something behind us. We turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she'd been through a nightmare, but there was something in her eyes that told us she was telling the truth. "What's your name?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to work here at Mandela Catalogue." Matt stepped forward, his hand extended in greeting. "We're looking for answers about the hum," he said. Sarah's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route. "It started a few weeks ago," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "At first we thought it was just noise, but then people started acting differently." Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with interest. "Like what?" Emma asked, her pencil poised over her notebook. Sarah hesitated before speaking. People would be in meetings or working on projects, and then suddenly they'd stop and stare into space, like they were seeing something that no one else could see. Alex frowned, his brow furrowed in concern. "Did you ever figure out what was causing it?" Matt asked, his voice firm with determination. Sarah shook her head. "No," she said, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "We tried everything to stop it, but nothing worked, and then the hum started." I nodded sympathetically, my mind racing with theories about what might be happening. But as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was hiding something from us, something important. As we continued to question Sarah, I couldn't help but feel that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Matt, too, seemed to sense that something was off, his eyes narrowing as he listened to her words. Rachel and Alex exchanged a skeptical glance, their faces filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. Emma, meanwhile, sat quietly in the corner, her notebook open in front of her, jotting down every detail Sarah shared. But it wasn't until Matt mentioned the code name Erebus that Sarah's demeanor changed. Her eyes flashed with fear, and she took a step back, as if retreating from something that was too much to bear. "What do you know about Erebus?" Matt asked, his voice low and urgent. Sarah hesitated before speaking, her words spilling out in a rush. "Erebus is what we called the project," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one that went horribly wrong." Rachel's eyes widened with interest, and Alex leaned forward, his face tense with anticipation. Emma's pencil paused midair as if caught in mid-motion. Matt's eyes locked onto Sarah's, his expression unyielding. "What happened?" he asked, his voice firm with determination. Sarah took a deep breath before answering, her words dripping with sorrow and regret. "Erebus was an experiment," she began. "A project to harness the power of the human mind." Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Like a psychic network," Alex ventured, his voice laced with skepticism. Sarah's gaze drifted into the distance as if searching for something lost long ago. "It was more than that," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "We were trying to create a shared consciousness." Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. "A collective mind." Matt repeated, his brow furrowed in concern. Sarah nodded, her face pale with the memory of what they had done. "Yes, we wanted to create a collective mind where we could access each other's thoughts and memories." Rachel's voice was laced with horror. "And what happened when it didn't work?" Sarah's eyes met Matt's, filled with a deep sadness. The experiment went catastrophically wrong, she said. People lost their minds or worse. And the hum was the result. As we delved deeper into the mysteries of Mandela Catalogue, our footsteps echoed through the deserted corridors. The air was thick with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the soft rustling of old files and the creaking of rusty machinery. Emma led the way, her flashlight casting flickering shadows on the walls as she navigated the dark passageways. Rachel followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Alex brought up the rear, his hand resting on the grip of his gun, ever vigilant for any signs of trouble. Matt and Sarah walked side by side, their faces set with determination as they searched for evidence of what had happened to the researchers who once worked here. As we turned a corner, Emma halted suddenly, her light fixed on a door that seemed out of place among the other rooms. "This one's been sealed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma's gaze drifted to the door, her expression grim. "It looks like it's been padlocked and barricaded from the inside." Matt nodded, his face set with determination. "We need to know what was going on in here." Sarah's voice was laced with fear. "I don't think we want to go in there." But Emma was already pushing open the door, her light spilling into the room like a beacon of hope. As we stepped inside, our eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light within. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. Old equipment lay scattered about, some of it broken and discarded, while other pieces seemed intact but eerily silent. In the center of the room, a large console dominated the space, its screen flickering with a maddening array of colors and symbols. Matt approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the screen as if mesmerized by some hidden truth. As he reached out to touch it, Rachel grabbed his arm, her voice firm but urgent. "Wait!" Alex's hand closed around her wrist, his grip steady but reassuring. Emma turned back, her light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I don't know," Matt replied, his eyes still fixed on the screen. But as he looked closer, a shiver ran down my spine. The symbols seemed to be shifting, rearranging themselves into some sort of message. Suddenly, the console sprang to life, its screen erupting in a blaze of color and light that was both beautiful and terrifying. "What's happening?" Emma cried out, her voice lost in the cacophony of sound. But Matt just stood there, transfixed by the glowing display as if he were seeing something that no one else could see. As we ventured deeper into Mandela Catalogue, our stomachs began to rumble with anticipation. We had heard that the food court was a popular spot for researchers and staff, but what we found there would make our skin crawl. Emma led the way, her eyes scanning the empty tables and chairs as if searching for some hidden clue. Rachel followed closely behind, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Alex brought up the rear, his hand resting on the grip of his gun, ever vigilant for any signs of trouble. Matt and Sarah walked side by side, their faces set with determination as they searched for evidence of what had happened to the researchers who once worked here. As we entered the food court, a wave of unease washed over me. The tables were all still, covered in plastic tablecloths that seemed out of place among the bustling cafeteria. But it was what lay on the tables themselves that made my blood run cold. Rachel gasped as she saw them trays of food, each one perfectly arranged and served with precision, but with no signs of life anywhere. "What is this?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt's eyes scanned the area, his expression grim. "It looks like they were abandoned mid-meal." Sarah's face went pale as she spotted something on one of the tables. "Oh God, what's that?" She pointed to a plate of food with a single bite taken out of it, but there was no sign of who might have eaten it. As we walked closer, I could see the faint outline of a handprint on the table, cold and clammy, as if someone had left their mark in haste. Alex's grip on his gun tightened. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. But Emma was already examining the food on the tables more closely, her eyes scanning the plates for any clues. "Wait," she said, her voice firm but cautious. "Let me see what I can find." As she delved deeper into the mystery of the abandoned meal, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched and that our own meals would soon be next on the menu. As we ventured deeper into the heart of Mandela Catalogue, our footsteps echoed through the deserted corridors. We had been searching for clues for what felt like hours, but every door we opened led to more questions than answers. Emma led the way, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls as she navigated the dark passageways. Rachel followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Alex brought up the rear, his hand resting on the grip of his gun, ever vigilant for any signs of trouble. Matt and Sarah walked side by side, their faces set with determination as they searched for evidence of what had happened to the researchers who once worked here. As we turned a corner, Emma halted suddenly, her light fixed on a door that seemed out of place among the other rooms. "This one's been sealed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma's gaze drifted to the door, her expression grim. "It looks like it's been padlocked and barricaded from the inside." Matt nodded, his face set with determination. "We need to know what was going on in here." Sarah's voice was laced with fear. "I don't think we want to go in there." But Emma was already pushing open the door, her light spilling into the room like a beacon of hope. As we stepped inside, our eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light within. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. Old equipment lay scattered about, some of it broken and discarded, while other pieces seemed intact but eerily silent. In the center of the room, a large console dominated the space, its screen flickering with a maddening array of colors and symbols. Suddenly, Matt's eyes locked onto something on the wall, a message scrawled in red letters, seemingly in haste. As we turned to leave the room, Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here now." Rachel's eyes scanned the room frantically, her face pale with fear. Alex nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. Matt and Sarah exchanged a nervous glance, but followed Emma as she led the way back through the winding corridors. We moved swiftly, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we tried to put as much distance between ourselves and the mysterious message as possible. But every step felt like a betrayal, had we just walked into a trap. As we turned a corner, the lights from the corridor we'd come from flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Emma's light faltered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "What's happening?" Matt asked, his voice laced with panic. Rachel's eyes locked onto the wall, her face frozen in terror. "It's not just the lights," she whispered. "The entire mall is going dark." We stumbled forward, our hands outstretched in front of us like blind people feeling their way through a cave. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the creaking of old machinery and the soft hum of something else, something that didn't sound human. Suddenly, Emma's light flickered back to life, casting a beam of light down the corridor ahead. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice firm but urgent. We stumbled after her, our hearts pounding in our chests like drums. As we ran, the darkness seemed to close in around us, until it felt like we were being swallowed whole. But Emma kept pushing forward, her light leading the way through the blackness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went dark again. We stumbled to a halt, our hands outstretched in front of us like blind people feeling their way through a cave. The silence was oppressive, heavy with an unseen presence that made my skin crawl. "What now?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's light flickered back to life, casting a beam of light down the corridor ahead. But this time, it wasn't just her light, there were others too. Flickering lights from other corridors, other rooms. It was as if the entire mall was coming alive and we were trapped in the middle of it all. As we stood there, frozen in terror, the lights began to pulse and strobe, casting an eerie glow over the deserted corridors. It was then that we saw them, the figures, emerging from the shadows like specters from a nightmare. They were humanoid, yet not quite human, their bodies twisted and distorted in ways that defied nature. Emma's light faltered as she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror. "What are they?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Rachel's face was white as a sheet, her mouth frozen open in a silent scream. Alex's gun hung limp from his hand, his eyes fixed on the figures with a mix of fascination and terror. And I felt my mind reel as I tried to comprehend the true horror that stood before us. The figures began to move closer, their twisted bodies gliding across the floor with an unnatural silence. As they drew near, we saw that they were not just creatures, they were experiments, twisted abominations born from the darkest recesses of Mandela Catalogue's twisted mind. They were the product of some deranged scientist's twisted imagination, created to satisfy a hunger for human suffering and terror. And then, it hit me, the true horror of what we had stumbled into. The food court, the abandoned meal, the mysterious message scrawled on the wall. It was all just a ruse, a distraction from the real horror that lurked in the shadows. The mall was not just a place of commerce and entertainment. It was a laboratory, a twisted playground where human subjects were subjected to unspeakable horrors for the sake of scientific inquiry. And we had stumbled into its darkest heart. As we stood there, frozen in terror, the figures began to close in on us. Emma's light faltered as she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror. Matt whispered, "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The creatures surrounded us, their twisted bodies forming a living wall that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt like I was being consumed by an endless void, a void that had no bottom and no end. Rachel's face went white as she whispered, "We're trapped." Alex's gun hung limp from his hand, his eyes fixed on the creatures with a mix of fascination and terror. And then, it hit me, we were not going to escape. The mall was a labyrinth, a never-ending maze that would consume us all. I felt my mind reel as I realized that we were trapped in an eternal loop, reliving the same moments over and over again. The creatures began to move closer, their twisted bodies gliding across the floor with an unnatural silence. As they drew near, I saw that they were not just creatures. They were our own reflections, twisted versions of ourselves that had been warped by the darkness of the mall. And then, it hit me, we were not alive. We were experiments, created to satisfy the hunger for human suffering and terror that lurked in the shadows of Mandela Catalogue. The food court, the abandoned meal, the mysterious message scrawled on the wall. It was all just a simulation, a twisted game designed to keep us trapped forever. I felt my mind shatter as I realized that we were not going to escape. We were going to be trapped in this endless void forever, reliving the same moments over and over again. The creatures closed in on us, their twisted bodies forming a living wall that seemed to stretch on forever. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was back at the entrance of the mall, my heart pounding with fear. But something was different. The doors were open, the lights were on, and the mall was empty. It was as if we had never been here at all, or had we?